world, education systems both reflect and create the societies in which they exist. Latin America and the Caribbean has come a long way in the fight against social injustice, but it remains the most unequal region in the world. In many classrooms, stigma and stereotypes are preventing millions of children from poor and marginalized communities from reaching their full potential. COVID-19 is making the situation even harder.
I don't have the internet for my kids then. My kids then reaching nowhere in life, you know? It burned my heart to know them sitting at home, can't go to school.
The region has been a leader in promoting social spending for education purposes, keeping children in school longer. But the gap between policies supporting inclusive education and their implementation in classrooms sometimes remains too wide. While laws in most countries call for children with disabilities to be educated in inclusive settings, not many mainstream schools receive students with disabilities in practice. A shift towards truly inclusive education requires support from all sides of society, from students to parents and principals, and from governments to grassroots organizations.
Hay un falta de conocimiento de los derechos que tienen los niños refugiados para ingresar en el sistema educativo. Eso se presta a veces a asuntos de discriminación, xenofobia, por no conocer el sistema, por no conocer de dónde provienen esos niños, esas familias.
Learners need safe and accessible schools where all can learn from a curriculum that recognizes diversity and can be adapted to learners' needs. Countries also need to prepare, empower and motivate the education workforce with all teachers prepared to teach all students. Teachers need support to make sure the shift to distance learning does not deepen education divides. In the Amazon region of Peru, loudspeakers were installed in communities to broadcast lessons.
A través de ese parlante nosotros escuchamos que el profesor está haciendo clase con nosotros.
While the region has made great progress gathering information on those being left behind, much more and better data is needed. A shift towards inclusion is not easy, but it is possible and has measurable benefits for everyone.
Con la llegada de nuestros amigos venezolanos aquí al país, podemos conectarnos una entrelazación entre hermanos peruanos y venezolanos y podemos conversar como personas civilizadas y enterarnos de lo que sucede allá en Venezuela y de una forma darles un apoyo moral.
As countries work together, learning from one another and building schools that recognize and embrace diversity, they can steer their societies towards a new and better future for all.
Muy buenas tardes a todas y todos. Para comenzar, me gustaría pedirles a las y los panelistas si pueden.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to welcome you and ask our panelists to turn on their videos. My name is Paula Kleiner. On behalf of UNESCO, I would like to welcome you to this web seminar, School Inclusion for Migrant, Refugee, and Displaced Persons in Latin America and the Caribbean. This is taking place today on December 18th on the International Day of Migrants. We know that migration has been marked by this determination to overcome adversity and the search for a better life. Economic, environmental, and political crises have implemented this bettering of their situation without increasing the global phenomenon. And within this context of an uncertainty, urgency, and complexity, the challenges of international migration require a greater cooperation and collective action. We would like to have a dialogue today on education, human mobility, and educational inclusion. This session is also part of the GEM 2020 report, Latin America and the Caribbean, Inclusive Education, Everyone Without Exception. Its name offers a deep analysis of all our main challenges in reaching inclusive education for everyone in a region that is characterized by one of the largest and most challenging inequalities. So before kicking off the event, I'd like to remind you that this event is being recorded and we have simultaneous interpreting in English and Spanish, which you can activate at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen with the globe. This is being transmitted direct on YouTube, UNESCO Santiago, and on GEM Reports Facebook. I would like to invite you to leave your questions for the panel in the bottom of your screen if you are connected on Zoom, and of course in the chat we have our colleagues from UNESCO Santiago. They will be collecting and systematizing, organizing your questions. So without further ado, I'd like to offer the floor to two colleagues from UNESCO who will be offering a few initial ideas to begin to address the topic that brings us here today. I'd like to offer the floor to Manos Antonines. He is the director of the GEM report, and he will be talking to us about the GEM LAC report 2020. Manos, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, Paola.
El micrófono y la cámara.
Thank you, Paola.
Thank you to all of you, and allow me for a change. I have been trying hard in recent weeks as we launched the reports all over the region to trying to speak in Spanish, but allow me to speak, as this is the last day of a long period, in English. So I'm going to present briefly the results of the report on inclusion in education, but I'm also going to take you back a little bit towards the report that we published last year. That was the report on education, migration, and displacement. And it was a rare occasion where two themes that we launched one year after the other were so closely linked in many ways. And really the link was that of inclusion. Now, talking of inclusion, I think it's very important, and I hope I'm not confusing you. I'm speaking in English, but we have adjusted the presentation to be in Spanish, so to keep everyone happy. The big point that this report on inclusion is trying to make is the idea that when the international community subscribed to the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, under SDG 4, there is a commitment on inclusive education. And it's fair to say that for many countries around the world, the concept of inclusive education is not necessarily clear. It's not necessarily one that everybody has the same opinion. We know that it is thanks to the consistent efforts of people who have been defending the rights of persons with disabilities that we have ended up with the commitment and the having enshrined the right to inclusive education in 2006 at the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But it was the UN committee that monitors the implementation of this convention that actually deliberated for another 10 years until in 2016 they came with an interpretation of Article 24 on inclusive education. And that article, that general comment, essentially reminds us and gives us a very simple but very powerful message that the mechanisms that exclude people with disabilities are in effect no different from those that exclude any other population group. And that is precisely why the report has taken the concept of inclusion to be first and foremost a process that believes in the potential of every student and the need of the education system to adjust to the needs of these different groups, which at the end of the day never really belong to any one group because we all have overlapping identities and backgrounds. So nevertheless, despite this, we have the challenge that countries around the world are not quite yet up to speed with this definition. And this is the key message of the report, that we need to really open up the definition of inclusive education so that it covers all learners, regardless of their identity, their background, and their abilities. And a review that we did by the report team did, so that in the region about 60% of countries have a definition of inclusive education, but a similar percentage also defines in that definition that it covers multiple groups. So basically 1 in 3 countries only have that broad conception of inclusive education that we need. As Paula said, we have just started now, as of last year, launching a regional edition of the report where we take the theme and we look in more depth at that theme in a particular region. And the regional report on inclusion and education in Latin America and the Caribbean focuses on and draws on the key messages, structure and recommendations of the global report, especially its work that has documented the laws and policies that every country in the world is using to implement inclusion education. This is now available in our new website called Peer, where country profiles can be consulted to help build policy dialogue. But we also had commissioned 29 case studies in collaboration with the partners for this report. So UNESCO Santiago, the Regional Bureau on Education in Latin America and the Caribbean, and SUMA, a project also based in Santiago. And among those 29 case studies, we also had 3 that focused on migration and displacement. They're highlighted on the map. Colombia was one, the epicenter of the migration crisis of recent years. Costa Rica, which has for a long time had a more quiet, let's say, but still steady and large community of international migrants, the way maybe you find in other parts of the world much more, mainly from nearby Nicaragua. And also the special case of the Dominican Republic, where a history of migration from neighboring Haiti is having quite significant effects on the education opportunities of those with an immigrant background. Now, let me take you briefly and show to you the relations between the 2 reports and their recommendations. Then a 2019 report had 7 recommendations. It emphasized the need to protect the rights of migrants and refugees, the education rights of migrants and refugees, which is not always the case. And secondly, and most importantly, help pass the message all around the world that it is really important to include them in national education systems and not have them educated in separate systems. We need them to respond to their needs. We need to recognize the histories and what they bring to the host communities through the curriculum and textbooks. Prepare teachers who are often unprepared and surprised to see diversity in their classroom. Help fulfill their potential that mainly refer to the recognition of their qualifications, and bring the necessary changes to the international aid architecture to help bridge gaps. And we know how the region has also suffered from that point of view. Now, you can see from there the links and the bridges to the recommendations of the 2020 report. I'm not going to take you through all of them. You already heard me saying talking about the need for a larger definition of inclusive education. There are two recommendations on financing and on sharing of resources, which are important for inclusion, where people with special education needs tend to be concentrated in parts, and we need to make sure that these resources are spread in every school. Then there are two recommendations on partnerships, how governments need to consult with communities and how they need internally to collaborate with other sectors and with other levels of government. And also a related one on the relationship with non-governmental organizations, to which I'm going to refer in a minute. Then there was a maybe more cryptic for a community that talks about migration and displacement, a more cryptic reference to universal design. But basically, that was an appeal and a call for flexibility in education systems, very similar to the recommendation number 4 from the migration report, the need to have curricula where everybody feels that they belong, that they're part of the education plan and project. And then recommendations on training teachers, very similar to 2019. Collecting data, but with attention and respect, because often there's a lot of stigmatization when it comes to including vulnerable groups. And finally, learning from peers, more or less what we're doing now, because there's no single route to inclusion. So just to make some references to examples in the regional report that refer to migration challenges. The role of non-governmental actors, I mentioned before, it is very important. They often act and work in areas where governments do not want to or have challenges to address. We discussed the particular case. We should not forget that in the Caribbean, in English-speaking Caribbean, there are also Venezuelan migrants and refugees who have special challenge of the language, the linguistic difference. So that's very, very important there. In Trinidad and Tobago, one of the countries that have been bearing the brunt of this movement, we see the government sometimes reluctant to include these children in the national education system, and NGOs filling the gaps, offering valuable services. And it's very important to let that space, create that space, but making sure that whatever they provide as services is consistent with the principle of inclusion. Laws and policies, as I mentioned before, may not have been particularly constructive towards the inclusion of Venezuelans in Trinidad and Tobago, but in other countries in Latin America, there has been really an open arms policy to try and accommodate the needs of these students, often where necessary, as in Colombia, by relaxing some of the strict requirements for migration and examination. That doesn't mean that there have not been considerable problems in the implementation, in the understanding of these central guidelines at the local level. And that's a classic example of what has happened over the years in the Dominican Republic, where we know that officially, although not extremely clearly, not extremely explicitly, the students of immigrant background, as I said, primarily Haitian, should be allowed and registered in schools and take part in examinations. But the messages that schools receive are sometimes mixed, and often school leaders feel uncertain about what to do and how to respond. By contrast, in the more perhaps different context of Nicaraguan immigration to Costa Rica, where 4% of students are of that background, the country has recognized the right to education, and has not just recognized the right to education of these students, but has also taken steps to make sure that there are resources that can support the curricular and extracurricular adjustments to help these students, as well as other students. As we know, sometimes there are the groups that use a corridor of Central America to emigrate further away, but the country has adjusted its policies, making sure that its programs really suit the needs of these particular communities. And last but not least, the case of teachers. As I mentioned, there are other parts of the region that have been attracting immigrants from different countries. Brazil, Sao Paulo is one particular case where the local government has been adapting its training programs for teachers. The Buenos Aires is one of the focal points for immigration in the region. 34% of the teachers have been receiving at least 10% of their students from other countries. And that means that that has particular effects. We know that their performance, their reading outcomes in international assessments like PISA are at least a third below those of other students. So teachers need preparations, need adjustments, and that's also applying not only to Latin America, it also applies to the Caribbean. Increasingly, small island states, and we hear that from different parts of the world. We mentioned Anguilla, even Montserrat, have now, even though they're English-speaking countries, they have inflows of immigrants from Spanish-speaking countries, and they're struggling and not quite managing to provide the support that they need to teachers to accommodate these new populations in a world that, as we know, is on the move. So that brings me to an end. As a general introduction to the topics that you're going to discuss, I hope I touched upon the different interventions that are coming in this very rich panel, and I would like to thank you very much and on this International Migration Day celebration for organizing this event. Thank you again.
Muchísimas gracias, Manos. Sin duda, lo que tú mencionas hace además referencia con algunos de los comentarios que hemos recibido.
Thank you so much. Clearly, your comments are essential. We've already received some interesting questions and comments that shows that there's specific interest in addressing this broader concept of inclusion, which continues to be a pending challenge for many of the educational systems throughout the region. Now, clearly, over the last few years, we have witnessed key efforts and progress, particularly taking into consideration the fact that the communities throughout the region have been affected by a variety of different external factors, cultural factors, or other events such as health crisis, the natural disasters, increase in migration. So obviously, these factors involve a plethora of different challenges. So in order to address this, specifically in terms of the region and what other countries have conducted over the last few years and months, we are here with Ms. Iguchik, who's the head of the office of the Regional Office of UNESCO, the head of Right to Education. Yayoi, the floor is yours. Yayoi Seguivicek. Thank you, Paula. If you allow me, I will present in English. It's 1 a.m. in the morning, and I cannot speak Spanish that well at this time, so I apologize to all.
First of all, to Manos, the colleagues and headquarters, UNESCO, the Global Education Monitoring Report team, and also his team for having collaborated with us, the regional office for Latin America and the Caribbean, also for SUMA for having done this, having prepared this monumental groundbreaking, the report that very much helps us further promote the issue, the fundamental issue of inclusion in the, unfortunately, the most unequal continent in the world. So I just, next 5-7 minutes, I would like to share some points, some key points, some perspectives from UNESCO, with very much reference to the enormous work that's being undertaken by many countries around the world as we witness. So first of all, a little bit of a context. I mean, as we know very much, the Latin American Caribbean is very much rich in diversity culturally and socioeconomically as well. We have a huge number of people, particularly looking at the indigenous groups and languages. And unfortunately, as has been mentioned already, Paula, and also underpinned by the presentation of Manos, we are looking at the historic historical and systemic and structural issues of poverty and inequality, and what the ECLAC, United Nations Economic and Cultural Economic Commission for Latin American Caribbean, calls it a centuries-old cultural privilege. And when it comes to the migration of people in the continent, we have a hugely mixed flow of migration. About 5.5 million Venezuelan refugees and migrants, and millions more through Central America and Mexico, and also within the Caribbean, which is very much, it's nothing new, and this mixed flow of migration has been happening for decades in the continent, which makes it quite challenging for education provision. In terms of financing, we have seen a huge gaps. We have a huge requirements. At the same time, we have a huge gaps for this year. We are looking at only the less than half of the appeal met. This is for Venezuelan response. And when it comes to education response, we have only 21%. So which is very much a huge gap in financing the needs, the basic needs, ensuring the protection and provision of basic services for refugees and migrants, and this includes education. And this makes it very complicated and complex to provide and uphold the right to education in the region. And just a bit of data there we have from ECW and also from the country's work, approximately 40% of out-of-school population, Ecuador and Peru, and much more, of course, in Colombia. Next, please. I guess this year, unfortunately, we cannot talk about what's been happening in the region without really specifying the few key points that have impacted heavily by the pandemic in the region. We have a huge decline, expected contraction GDP according to the UN ECLAC that was announced a few days ago, and they say that it will be the worst in 120 years, and this makes it very much, it has a huge impact on the population groups that are on the move, and looking at the exposure to risk of infection with very little protection. And we have seen a quite number of people returning home countries due to dire situations in host countries with loss of livelihoods, shelter, benefits, and programs. And previously, when this pandemic started taking hold quite dramatically in March, we witnessed huge massive school closures in the region, which meant about 100% of previously enrolled refugee and migrant learners in public schools were out of school. This meant loss of learning, but at the same time, loss of provisional services, which had previously been provided for in the school compound, the school communities. And the host governments, of course, have been responding for a very long time, but they are under significant pressure to respond. At the same time, to prioritize their own needs internally. Next, please. So when it comes to inclusion of refugee migrant learners, we're looking at the two issues in the region from our perspectives, from work with many countries, many partners around the region. First, looking at the system-wide improvements. We have witnessed a huge spike in high-level political commitment. We should highlight here the process of Quito, which is a 70-member state regional intergovernmental mechanism, where this year's declaration with the presidency of government of Chile and with the champion Argentina for education chapter clearly indicated the full commitment to upholding the right to education for the first time of this fairly robust intergovernmental mechanism. And also we have seen increasingly more by promoting regional solidarity through dialogue and cooperation. We have very robust regional education technical working group with many member states from the region who have fully committed to upholding the right to education, including refugee and migrant learners in all public learning institutions, and also highlighting the work of regional education group, which is co-led by UNICEF and Save the Children. Important to point out, as has been pointed out with data by Manos, is that we have seen quite a few countries in the region, which takes time, of course, but they are looking at enabling legislative and policy environments, looking at amendments and revisions to ensure that the removal of barriers to access and learning. And we have seen good examples in Colombia and Ecuador. Of course, it takes time, this very removing barriers just in terms of legislation and policy, but good progress has been made, and very much of recognition, huge efforts made by member states. We know what it takes to do that, politically speaking, as well. No? And also what's important is as when people move across borders, even within countries, it's important to recognize that they come with a prior knowledge and prior learning. And recognition of that is a key, oftentimes barrier. But in Latin America, there's a very strong intergovernmental Convenio Andrés Bello, which has quite a number of countries that have signed up to, which is becoming, which has played a key role in this in the recognition of prior learning and knowledge. And there is a potential partnership to introduce UNESCO qualifications passport, which is will serve as something similar, but mostly in a higher education sphere. Next, please. So on the second level, which basically is looking at the more what goes on inside the school community, school inside the learning environment, is that we have seen, of course, a huge number, a lot of support going to public learning institutions at all levels, from early childhood all the way to higher education. What may be missing here is support to adult education, adult learning, which always tends to get left behind when it comes to refugee migrant response, in not only in the American Caribbean, but in other contexts as well. And as has been mentioned by Manos already, we need we have seen quite a huge surge in supporting and strengthening capacities of education personnel through different teacher training programs and support and mentoring and guidance and support, which is without teachers at the heart of education and learning, we cannot do anything at all. And there we need to support furthermore at all levels. Also, the last 2 points is a lot about integrating social emotional learning, and also improving social cohesion, school community as a place where refugee and migrant and host communities come into play and create an enabling environment, not only for learning, but also the living together in the particular community, as we saw in the first video we saw in the Peruvian kid who talked about providing a lot of support and even moral support, which is it's quite remarkable for a 10-year-old kid to be able to do that, and it's a lot of lesson learned for all of us. Next, please. Just to finish up from our perspectives from UNESCO, as we support further member states that are bearing a huge burden, huge on their shoulders, financing and programs, and a lot of communities as well. Together with partners, we're looking at the 5 key points. I think that quite critical to advance further, as it's the title of the report says, all means all, and ensuring inclusion. Its first point is advocacy. We need to, in this midst of COVID, everything becomes priority, but we need to make sure that no one is left behind. This is Agenda 2030. All countries, all partners have signed up to, and we need to make our voices clear and louder, and by advocating together. And second point is a policy shift. I think that in the Latin American Caribbean, as I've seen other contexts as well, the public education system is very strong, including a huge number of children, the young people from all walks of lives. However, looking at the diversified alternative learning pathways and also programs, as we see in Mexico and Venezuela as well, to enable more children to be able to take advantage of course, certified learning programs. This is quite important. Capacity development, which of course underpins all to do with the provision of education, Particularly, I want to highlight here the need for data, need for monitoring, and as we support further member states to improve the availability and use of data through such as education management information system is quite the key. And the fourth point is policy and technical dialogue, knowledge resource exchange, as mentioned already, education sector group, a working group, quite a lot of very robust, very strong regional, technical, also policy groups that can come together to promote and also to jointly deliver on key issues, key needs, priorities, both at the regional and also national level. What is hugely pending, and you'll be very much looking forward to hearing from different panels this time, is the multi-sectoral response. And in all emergencies around the world, and I think Latin America, Caribbean is not an exception, that we need to look at how we need to really break down the barriers of the sectoral approach, vertical approach to providing services. So education, schools can be one place where all services can come to, but of course ministries and different partners have the governance issues and also the financing issues that make it quite challenging to provide strong, the systemic, integrated, the multi-sector response. So I think that's it from our part in UNESCO. Thank you. Back to you, Paula.
Muchísimas gracias, Yayoi. Considerando también uno de los elementos que mencionabas del trabajo
Thank you,
intersectorial.
Yayoi. Also taking into consideration some multi-sectorial work, as you mentioned. And before going to the panel, I'd like to show you a video that we've been working on here at UNESCO Santiago. We know that one of the core elements of this response has to do not only with the players that actually work on the educational aspects, but also the protagonists. So we would like to offer them that space. We have some migrant persons that have been working with us, and we'd like to share this with you today.
Hola, mi nombre es Mari Carmen.
Y mi nombre es Gabriel.
Hello, my name is Mari Carmen. I'm Gabriel, and we are a family of migrant Venezuelans. Our story begins in 2018 when my husband had to come to Peru. And one of our challenges was that we had to separate ourselves. That was the first challenge. In 2019, after we gathered money to come, my children and I came to meet him. It has been the case for many Venezuelan families who have had to leave Venezuela to other parts of the world. It's been very difficult because we have had to adapt to new cultures, new beliefs. However, we have felt the support of Peruvian and Venezuelan families who have offered us support in trying to reach our objectives and overcoming our hardships. And we are thankful to all these families who have helped us. We're very, very thankful for the Peruvian people who have opened their arms to us. From the educational perspective, the children in September, we were able to find to insert them into the educational system. And in fact, the teacher of our youngest says he is one of the best students. She is one of the best students she's had. And that made our daughter feel very happy. It's a good thing. And this year, we've had a good communication with the teachers, and the children feel fully integrated. And we have somehow collaborated with the institution in cultural activities, which where our daughter presented a national Venezuelan dance. So things have gone well. We're all fully integrated. And Fortunately, we have felt comfortable. And again, there's been a good match between the school, us, our child. It has been a significant experience. We have not felt, at any point, we have not felt excluded from the educational system. On the contrary, our children were very well received. They were welcomed. And the representatives, the teachers, the students have been welcoming. We have felt this and we're thankful for that. We're very thankful to the school that has given us all this support.
Muchísimas gracias, Luis. Uno de los elementos que
Thank you for the video. One of the things I'd like to highlight is that the educational experience is not only about the right to education specifically. It has to do with recognizing its multiplying effect, which reaches the whole family. It is not only the students that actually go to school, either in person or online, but it actually reaches the family by offering other services as well. So with this, I'd like to begin our discussion panel. I'd like to invite our panelists to turn on their cameras so that we can begin this section. While you do that, I would like to mention some of the objectives of this discussion. As the GEM report mentions, it explores the specific ways in which students at the risk of being excluded address the educational inclusion processes. And I would like to mention that there are some specific aspects to human mobility with their own challenges. And today, the invitation we've made has been to discuss this. Those of you who have seen our conceptual note know that our guests come from different places or different areas of the educational proposal. We want to address the challenges of intersectorial work, not only with schools, but also with other organizations in charge of education. Second, the challenge of financing. It continues to be a challenge specifically for the educational sector because we know that when there's emergencies, other elements tend to be prioritized and education is left to its own devices or to development and long-term actions. The third element has to do with discussing the availability of data and information for decision-making. It is an extremely important element for the migrant population, and especially for those who find themselves in uncertain migratory processes and do not have access to traditional data from the state. So these three elements are what will guide us. I'd like to introduce our panelists now. We have Fabiola Miranda with us. She is the coordinator of the Educación para Todos division from the Ministry of Education in Chile. We also have the Maria Cristina Escobar from the Ministry of Education of Colombia. We also have senior expert in emergencies, regional Save the Children, Victoria Ward. Also with us is Matthew Branswag, who is the senior assistant for protection at ACNUR. So just to share with you how we're going to do this, I will ask a few questions, but if you feel that you want to supplement someone else's question, please do make a gesture with the hand and I will offer you the floor. We want this to be a more dynamic conversation, not so strict in terms of participation. So to begin, I would like to refer to educational systems and their adaptation processes. We've talked about, well, Manos mentioned the importance of having a broader inclusion system that schools in their implementation processes, some initiatives have had to expand. I would like to hear a little more, Fabiola, about how Chile is working to guarantee that we have sufficient funding for education, especially for people in the context of mobility. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, I would like to jump right into the question. I'd like to say that our country since 2015 has had an inclusion law, and this law favors the development of policies for adaptation and for guaranteeing the right to education of all people without any form of discrimination. So this umbrella allows us to advance in different groups that need special protection by emphasizing, in this case specifically, our students who find themselves in a situation of mobility, and much of the existing many of the existing regulations are applicable, but we have been working to have equal opportunities, not only in the system, but also for a series of benefits that the system provides. So these normative modifications, as I said before in the introduction, have had to be more flexible. For example, when students come, they need to work on this. We've been adapting the things so that a student coming from abroad can quickly join the educational system. What if they don't have the documentation? So irrespective of their migrant situation, they can quickly enter the educational system because that generates the possibility of this family being able to have some sort of or sense of normalcy. In
So as
terms
far
of
as
financing, the educational system in Chile works in a centralized manner, and from there we are
so we are providing
including
resources to all
everyone by
of
means of
the
a basic
students under
subvention,
a
and
subsidy. This allows us to distinguish between foreigners and nationals, but we provide coverage. And this has always been the focus of our attention, to ensure that there is equal access. Now, there are key benefits here that are provided as far as support, textbooks, for example, tools, school supplies, computers, for example, for 7th graders. There's also this transportation card, which helps out. And here I would like to refer to something specific, which is the school meal program. Now, this school meal program does focus on certain students and reaches more than 4 million students. Let me provide you with this example, because last year, this school meal program started working with some interesting ingredients that provide menus and meals for the 5 most common cultures in this region, helping to add typical foods of Venezuela, Peru, Colombia, for example. And so in that regard, financing, although I started talking about the base aspects, we have another subsidy that is quite unique and aims to support those students who need support. So affirmative action measures, if you will, so that we can help them with their learning. We know that the ministries have their own legal mandates, and this is preferential support that is available for all of our students, but is actually provided to the school supporters, financial supporters, and it comes up with a specific curricular design. There's a gap here that we need to close. For example, our students who have the IP under the IP program have issues in that the ministries cannot provide resources to them. So a series of actions have been drawn up to address this. It's been slow. We know that there's bureaucracy, obviously, and regulatory issues that we have had to overcome, and that's something we are chasing behind, obviously. And Paula, maybe you could help me out a bit. I know there's two questions in one. Maybe I'm going to refer to the other question now. I know there's a funding question, but let me refer to the other aspect, how this is not just a part of the ministry's purview. There's this intersectoral coordination that is necessary to make progress and ensure that these individuals and a specific group of individuals can exercise their right to education. Now, the Ministry of Education has created a technical unit. It's called the Education for All unit. And this unit, this department, is in charge of the technical aspects that allow to coordinate with the other ministries so that they can do good on this partnership and make progress. So we have the Ministry of the Interior, for example, that provides certain aspects that are necessary to regulate this situation, the situation of our students who are in a not so regulated migrant situation. So the importance of the Ministry of the Interior is that it provides tools so that we can ensure that these students are included when they're not included under the preferential subsidy. And then we have the Undersecretariat of Human Rights that is drawing up a report and coming up with a series of affirmative actions to guarantee the right to education to this specific group of students. And now we also have a collaborative partnership with the Ministry of Housing so that for the more precarious settlements, we will be able to coordinate efforts to not just identify those students and support those students and follow up on their educational progress of those students who are in the system, but also to help those who are out of the system, who are in these settlements, these camps, those are living in more precarious situations, and those who have not been able to gain access to education, not just because of the access barriers, but because they live in a precarious situation, which makes it even more challenging for them to access education. This is a pending issue still. We're trying to figure out the best way to bring education to them, those who are out of the system, not in the system, and they're part of our efforts. So very well, thank you. Let me give the floor back to Paula. Thank you, Fabiola. You were much clearer than I was in terms of this multiplying effect. We know that we have transportation service, we have a variety of different partners in the private system as well, helping out students and public-private partnerships. So you refer to something in your second half of your answer. Now, all these ministries are coordinated. How does this coordination occur? Is administratively speaking, how does this work? Because I was reading the chat and there's a lot of representatives from ministries online, and maybe this would be a useful explanation for them. Well, so the idea is to have this commonwealth of actors, and over the last year we've gained a lot of experience. Obviously, I need to mention the Ministry of Education and how we are now prepared to respond. We're dealing with this health crisis, and a lot of our actions have been implemented in the short and midterm to mitigate the impact of the health crisis on people on the move. And we are doing the best. We know people who are listening here, and we know that they have worked so hard. So chapeau to them. The ministry has recognized that a lot of the responses have somewhat been slowed down because of bureaucracy, but nonetheless, we know that the institutions are there doing everything necessary. And now, as far as intersectoral coordination is concerned, civil society has played a key role. civil society organizations have aided us in spreading the word. Civil society is always vigilant and attentive to the specific areas that warrant more work. Now, the educational community is also sending out these red flags, and this has allowed us to be aware of what's going on and to work in the more adverse contexts where there are minimal, limited tools. And I would also like to mention that there's another key aspect here, and just let me throw this out to you as an idea. There are partnerships that one has been able to delve into with academia and think tanks, and these have provided us with good frameworks, good references. We just wrapped up a pilot program. In fact, this is a course that is offered as a tool for teaching in a second language. This is for teachers. We know that many teachers have had to work with a significant portion of Haitian students, and there's a language barrier which makes this relationship even more complex. Let me go back to Paula's question. Now, we conducted a diagnosis as a ministry. Now, there's that assessment, and then we have all the various voices, and we know that we are having dialogue with the various stakeholders, and we have used all these tools to allow for other ministries to become involved and other ministries involved in this sanitary urgency and crisis. As I mentioned, the most optimal solution has been working bilaterally, ministry to ministry, ministry to ministry, or if the problem involves several ministries, just those who are actively involved in the solution meet up to come up with the best way out. And then we started expanding these groups with an intersectoral participation. As I mentioned, we involved the Ministry of the Interior in keeping with their legal mandate, and although it is true that significant progress has been made specifically with each sector, I think the most effective outcomes have come from when the ministries per se are involved. And there's a great deal of willingness, and the Ministry of Education has had to knock on other ministerial doors given the grave circumstances. Now, under normal circumstances, because we know that confinement has caused issues with regard to pressure and logistics, but students spend 8 hours of their day in school, and that has, as a result of the sanitary crisis, we've had to work with other ministries, and we are trying to come up with more flexible measures. Also, we are implementing new measures to guarantee not just access. If you have access, that doesn't solve the problem. We have an issue with regard to permanence over time, and we are hoping that the students will be able to complete their educational career, if you will, and have more permanency in our country. So that's also what we're doing, working with intercultural aspects. I have one more question for you. I apologize, I've gone beyond the script, but you talked about centralized funding under the school subsidy law. Now, let me ask about that specifically. Is there a specific percentage defined, percentage that is earmarked for the displaced, migrant, refugee student population, or is this a territory-based decision? Well, let me mention that the law is very emphatic. For each student in the classroom, and regardless of the student's situation or condition or nationality or socioeconomic situation, regardless of all that, there is a subsidy that is provided regardless to each establishment. And that is officially recognized. And when I say officially recognized, the establishment has to meet certain requirements. So you set up a commitment where they will receive a state subsidy. Now, the state subsidy, once again, is provided, and regardless of the student's condition, it needs to be applied to all their students. And this law has another article that refers to the possibility to select certain students. So that is something that allows us to, on the one hand, prevent singling out, but you can select. So the state must provide a subsidy to qualified establishments. And as far as that other contribution is concerned, the preferential school subsidy, which is related to more vulnerable students, that is where our foreign students will receive an additional contribution by way of the school. And there's a record, a registry of those schools. And unfortunately, not all of our students that have this IEP are included. And those IEP students are those who have not resolved their migratory situation yet. So in any event, there needs to be more progress there. But just FYI, this is for all. And courses are made available, educational materials, school supplies, for example, I refer to that. There's some specific programs related to reading readiness in Creole, for example. Those are for specific foreign students. There's also a talent program, for example, arts programs, sports programs, and the benefits provided thereunder are for all students across the board. Thank you very much, Fabiola. And with those comments on funding, financing are very interesting, by the way, that allows us to know what's being implemented, but also it refers to the gaps for those students who are in limbo in terms of their migration status. So let's refer to Colombia. 1.7 million individuals in Colombia in September were left out of the school system. Some of them are school students, school age, others are university students, what have you. So what initiatives is the Ministry of Education currently implementing to meet the educational needs of these boys and girls? And in that specific regard, how can we ensure that there's specific funding for them, taking into consideration their needs? The floor is yours.
Fabiola, pues encontramos atención muy
Thank
parecida a
you.
la que nos ha compartido.
Well, it's a similar situation for us, similar to what Fabiola has mentioned. And there's several million people who have migrated from Venezuela. Colombia has been one of the main receivers of migrating persons from Venezuela, either as a transition or as destination. And it's been 363,000 children who are now in the school system in Colombia, from elementary to high school. And in our systems, we have had many challenges in this care. You mentioned the intersectoriality, which has to do with access to education and participation, integration, economic integration, the right to raise children, citizens' rights, and everything that has to do with discrimination. And Colombia recognizes within the framework of public policies the right to education as a public right. And in this scenario, we have worked hand in hand with the presidency, especially with the health authorities, in order to guarantee that this intersectorial nature actually of the migration, of the rights for migrants, it actually takes place. We've looked at this care system for boys and girls. And we've also taken several measures in public policies hand in hand with the territorial authorities. The law in Colombia is decentralized. So in financing, the Ministry of Education has used a system called the General Participation System to generate the educational services. We also have our borders with the largest amount of children coming from Venezuela. And an exercise has been carried out there, which has been to eliminate barriers related to access to education, especially in terms of documents. We know that many of the parents and children arrive in Colombia without documents. We've generated a series of documents that have allowed us to strengthen access or to foster actually access of children to schools and we've done our best to make these laws and rules more flexible. Since 2015 to date, we've issued several laws allowing us to guarantee the rights to education of these children. Now, regarding what Fabiola mentioned in terms of guaranteeing access, we know that's important. Some are in transit or using Colombia as a destination, but human mobility, either because of work, safety, etc., is very important, and the people or the parents take their children with them. So it's important to look at these permanence strategies. We also discussed the school strategy related to permanence in the country and enormous challenges to work during times of the pandemic. We know that these children are most vulnerable. They find themselves in a precarious economic situation and are sometimes liable to fail and have to repeat a school year. And this has all been very important to include in the system. We know that educational quality in this situation is much more difficult. They didn't mention it in the video, but the strategies to welcome these people who have a migrant situation is difficult. We need to understand them as human beings, and the interaction for all is of the utmost importance. We also need to develop strategies for equal conditions for Venezuelans and Colombians, generate interaction within the educational communities for children, for the families, in order to generate social processes that will help build these interactions that will contribute to their integration and social inclusion. It is a recognition of this situation, which is very difficult for children and the adults and caregivers. It's important to recognize this and value it and work to improve all these strategies in the educational sector. The documents are being validated. We know that many children come in without documents and without all their paperwork or school paperwork. They leave everything behind. So Colombia has worked on validating these. Fabiola also mentioned that it's been very important for us to have the support and cooperation, international cooperation, especially in order to guarantee basic conditions for permanence, for example, school supplies and having adequate materials for these children in order to allow for a recognition of their participation. In the video, it wasn't mentioned. We need to recognize cultural aspects, what they are bringing and contributing to the Colombian society with the migratory process. This can be done both in the classroom as well as out of it. We need to work on on preventing xenophobia and growing inclusive societies from early childhood to their adolescence. We have also been working on educational permits. We know there's very important permits related and also bringing children up to speed, leveling them, and as I mentioned, xenophobia, educational quality, infrastructure as well. It's very important. We need to generate comfortable learning environments and faculty training. That is very important. We need to have teachers that are approachable, sensitive to the specificities of each child that they interact with. And in the classroom, they need to incorporate pedagogical strategies that will help these interactions, that the classroom be more inclusive and cognizant of their differences. This has been a huge endeavor of the educational sector. And in terms of financing, as I mentioned before, I believe that it's extremely important in the financing processes to guarantee these educational strategies. It's 363,000 children. That is huge. So we went from 334,000 boys and girls in 2018, 206,000 in 2019, and then 363,000 tuitions in 2020. And we know that not all of the people, children and adults come in through different areas of the country, but we do have a large amount of boys and girls, migrant boys and girls in our school system. So it's important to include them, and we need to understand or find ways to guarantee their rights to education, the right to education for migrant sectors of our population. And it is important to help boys, girls, mothers, parents, caregivers, as they find themselves in a difficult and complex situation. But there's also social, emotional aspects. We work a lot on the prevention of xenophobia. I mentioned this before. They repeat many things in the household that they see in schools. So it is important for us to work on building a better society, working on this migrant situation by offering them support. And in the sector and as citizens, we need to promote inclusion. So that is what I had to say on the side of the Ministry of Colombia. Thank you.
Thank you. That is a good segue to move from access to permanence and culmination and a reflection on quality as well. You commented on some interesting aspects that have an impact on quality, specifically with regard to xenophobia, discrimination, racism, because we know that these aspects may intercept or disrupt one's educational experience. Sometimes the students need to prioritize work over school as when they're immigrants and in this situation of being on the move. So thank you very much for your comments. Let me ask Matthew a question. So Matthew, I know you're working in Trinidad and Tobago, and we do know that this is one of the countries that has been most affected recently by immigration from Venezuela. We also know through various communications and political analyses that there are large gaps with regard to these students' access to the education sector as a result of regulation. So perhaps you could talk a bit about what's going on in Trinidad and Tobago update. We also know that as far as the protection area focus concerned, what else is being done for these students to protect them, and not just in terms of education. We know there are multiple factors that impact their ability to study, but so let's hear from you as far as your experience and perspective is concerned, since you're there on the ground. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Paula, y saludos
Thank
a
you,
todos
Paula.
desde
Greetings to
Trinidad y
all
Tobago.
from Trinidad and Tobago.
Déjame responder en
Allow
inglés.
me to answer in English.
So I will start by saying that Trinidad and Tobago is a signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention and the 1967 Protocol since the year 2000. However, despite being a signatory, local legislation does not allow the legal right to work and study for refugees and asylum seekers. We do have refugees and asylum seekers from over 30 countries in Trinidad and Tobago, but the majority of those would be from Venezuela, given our physical proximity to the Venezuelan mainland. In 2019, the government of Trinidad and Tobago conducted a registration exercise for Venezuelans, in which they were able to register around 16,000 persons. And one of the allowances for this registration was an exemption to allow persons to be able to work legally. However, permission to study was not included in these allowances. The cost of studying at private schools is high. And even for those students, the very small minority of students who were able to access private schools, there were still barriers to accreditation, which is related to their legal right to work and study. So UNHCR began holding consultations with refugees and asylum seekers in 2018 to understand what their needs were. And we found that the main needs that were expressed to us were access to accredited education, an education which allows students not only to learn, but to be able to move forward in their educational careers. English language learning for those who don't speak English, as well as integration with local students. So using this as a foundation, UNHCR got in partnership with UNICEF and onboarded several local actors from the local civil society sector to come up with a program for access to accredited education to all children who don't have access to the national system. So the main elements of this program, which was called Equal Place or Espacio de Equidad in Spanish, were access to 2 e-learning platforms, one in English and one in Spanish. These are for students at the primary and secondary school level. Supporting this access to platform would be English as a second language support, access to bilingual teachers and facilitators from both the local community as well as from the refugee community, the establishment of temporary learning spaces in different parts of the country, which would allow students to be able to physically come into a space, to have peer-to-peer interaction, and also to have some one-on-one interaction with teachers. The program was launched in September 2019 with around 1,000 students registered in the program. We immediately began to see some of the most important gaps showing up, which was obviously access to connectivity. So access to reliable internet connections for students to be able to learn at home. Challenges in implementing an English as a second language curriculum simultaneous to providing academic education for students, as well as a number of other problems related to the socioeconomic status of some of the persons of concern. We have been working to try and improve the offerings, but also the lack of the limited space available in temporary learning centers also gave us a limit to the number of students who would be able to come in person to be able to access. It's worth noting that in 2019, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago would have made a statement in which he said that schools, so there are a number of schools here, local schools, which are jointly run by the Ministry of Education, but also by religious boards, such as the Catholic Education Board of Management. And so what happened is that his statement said that he would allow any denominationally run school to accept children of Venezuelans who were registered in the registration. So we were able to make space available through the collaboration of the Catholic Education Board of Management for around 150 students at the primary school level. This went hand in hand with a large support program for teachers in the schools. So teacher training and support, extensive focus group discussions with teachers, students, and parents. And we were able to basically get all the way to the last hurdle, which is the administrative hurdle, which is to receive a study permit exemption for those students, but that has not yet been achieved. We can maybe talk about that later on if we have questions on that. So Equal Place, obviously during the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, we had to adapt our modality to a completely online modality. So we, with the assistance of UNICEF and partially funded by the European Union, were able to procure about 1,000 or so tablets, which were distributed to students to take home. And these tablets are now being used in students' homes to be able to access the platform. So we've moved to a completely online modality. This has actually allowed us, in addition to programs to support connectivity, has allowed us to expand to just around 11 or 1,200 students. So which I think is a big achievement. However, we still have a large gap in terms of the number of students who still need to get in. So UNHCR has known to us approximately 2,500 students, and there are an estimated up to 4,000 students between the ages of 5 and 17 who would also like access to the program. So in the coming year, expanding of resources to be able to establish more temporary learning spaces, to be able to procure more tablets and distribute them further, to be able to onboard more teachers and facilitators will take a lot more resources. In terms of stepping back to the broader context, UNHCR does conduct, via local implementing partners, case management of children and minors. So I am a focal point for child protection and for child protection case management. Our case management partners have specialist child protection workers who work to identify cases and to do case follow-up. UNHCR is also a part of a coordination mechanism for child protection, which includes a number of local actors, including the local government authorities, so the Children's Authority, which is under the purview of the Office of the Prime Minister, the Counter-Trafficking Unit, the Immigration Division, other UN agencies like UNICEF, UNFPA, and IOM, as well as local NGOs and local civil society actors who are involved in the child protection sector. And so we work to ensure that we can establish clear referral pathways so that we can establish complementary services for the implementation of best interest procedures and just to overall build up the capacity of the local child protection system. So Equal Place and the Education Working Group, which is the mechanism which helps to run Equal Place, does have an established communication mechanism with the Child Protection Working Group. And so there's frequent discussions, idea sharing, and capacity building amongst all of the actors. I turn it back over now to you, Paula.
Sobre eso, Matthew, quería hacerte una pregunta respecto
I have
al
a
trabajo.
question regarding your work. You talked about providing education outside of the formal education system. Now, we've seen that there are some interesting experiences throughout the region, and obviously this involves various challenges. How can you link up the formal with the non-formal education systems? Actually, I was reading a question on the YouTube channel. I'm sorry, I'm adding more questions, but I think it's quite opportune. How do you plan on linking those two models, formal and informal? Have you had any dialogue, any discussions that allow to come up with differential access routes for these students who are caught in the middle, I guess, or dealing with these two different systems?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So what I will say is that our end goal, our ultimate goal is to gain access to the local system and not to create a parallel system. So Equal Place is being designed in such a way that it will act as a natural transitional program. So it will basically bridge that gap between students who are displaced and who have been out of school for a certain amount of time, particularly those who don't speak the English language, to be able to sustainably transition into the local system. So it's built to complement the local education system. the education working group, which is the, as I mentioned, the group which oversees equal place, also now includes involvement on a technical level of the Ministry of Education of Trinidad and Tobago, which is something that we've been able to achieve in the last 6 months. So they're actually helping us to redesign the program and to put the different safeguards and the different pillars in place to allow for this transition. Now, that does not mean that this involvement is great, but it does not solve the administrative issue, and particularly the issue of allowing access, so of the government issuing permits or study permit exemptions. So our efforts to do this also go hand in hand with a very robust advocacy strategy on a number of levels. So at the highest levels, our reps and strategic allies within the government and within organizations that are close to the government are engaged in continuous advocacy, showing that basically identifying data-driven projections of how our involvement and how this project can not only benefit our population of concern, but also how it can benefit the local population. We have already started to build the capacity of local schools. We have funded, for example, we being UNHCR, UNICEF, and other members of the group have funded like material upgrades of classrooms, have funded, the procurement of video conferencing and of IT equipment and so on. So we really believe strongly that this is not a project that will only benefit populations of concern, but we really want to highlight the intersectionality and the potential benefits for all students. And this is really based on the right that all children have the same rights under the Conventions on the Rights of the Child, regardless of status. So really, we're trying to eliminate those differences while acknowledging the differences that exist currently in the system due to access. We're trying to equalize the playing field as much as possible, and this will take a lot of strategic advocacy. What we're also trying to do is there are a number of other actors who are involved on the ground, as they say, local NGOs, organizations who are doing their own ad hoc work, but from whom we can also learn a lot. So we are really not trying to silo ourselves into one way of doing things, but we're quite open to learning from the smaller organizations who are having some degree of success in their own activities. I think the COVID-19 context has really taught us a valuable lesson in that you have to be really willing to change your way of thinking and your way of operating at very short notice. And so I think we have actually, in a certain sense, advanced beyond the local education system, because I think our program really responded a lot quicker and a lot more efficiently than the current Ministry of Education program. So I think they also would have a lot to learn from our program. But this is how I think we have been approaching things. And the final thing to say is that, continued advocacy, not only at the highest level, but also within the community. So, from my lens of community-based protection, just making those linkages with students and with student groups and parent-teacher associations and so on to help amplify the positive messages, I think will really create enough, or should hopefully create enough of a stir on the informal side to be able to then convince the government to open up more pathways for formal integration into the local system.
Muchísimas gracias, Matthew. Tengo, por supuesto, más preguntas, pero el tiempo está acechándome.
Thank you so much. I have more questions, but I feel as though the clock is ticking louder and louder and louder. Susana, I have some questions for you. Two questions.
Save the Children on one hand, or as educational expert, in the sense, as Matthew mentioned, the interinstitutionality and intersectoriality are both very important in the ministries, outside of the ministries, with different levels of intervention in the educational sector. But what is Save the Children working on? How have you addressed these intersectorialities? And also at a regional level, I just wanted to hear from you, thinking that there are different instances of work with the ministries and other organizations. So I wanted you to introduce us a little to the interregional work being done here with Save the Children. As you mentioned, Paula, first of all, thank you for the invitation, for inviting Save the Children as an NGO. And as other speakers have said, and Matthew also, the NGOs form part of international cooperation, those of us who are international, and the local NGOs, the national NGOs also form part of that cooperation. International cooperation also transfers capacities and funds to support the magnificent effort that has been made with by the ministries of education. Of course, there's many challenges, so we try to support with know-how and with knowledge, with our tools to strengthen this situation. As you've said, NGOs work at two levels, at a regional level and also at a national level, even at a local level, because we're saying that we offer support not only to the actions of ministries of education, but also in the border of Colombia or Peru, where we carry out interventions in person, on site, and we have trainers, teachers that contribute to migrant children who are in transit or who have not they're in a shelter maybe, so they don't have access to educational systems per se. So at a regional level, just as other NGOs, Save the Children forms part of this structure that you just mentioned, and it is the regional educational group. So this educational group for Latin America and the Caribbean is like an intermediary between the global education cluster, the humanitarian part that guides all emergency situations, and the national clusters, where the work is actually to offer advocacy at different regional and national levels. For example, the Venezuela situation, the Quito situation, or with the migrant movement in Central America. We have a lot of work being done there with the FOPRE, and I'll offer you a little more detail in a moment. So what we do is precisely, we offer assistance for that right to education, and not just access, as my predecessors mentioned. It's not just about generating a quota, because of course we generate the possibility or the quota for them to participate, and we all contribute. We have all these teachers available, but basically we work on the cycle, the educational cycle, and everything else. So we carry out intersectorial work, and we do advocacy but, through the Ministry of Education, and we also offer advocacy with the FOPREL, the Forum of Presidents of the Legislative Bodies in Central America and the Caribbean, where we have promoted a basic law with an article on the integration of social protection systems with the educational sector in order to achieve access and permanence, and assistance to migrant children and those who have returned as well. So that is also part of the multidimensional dynamics and this multi-complex dynamics that we have in our region. Or, for example, we also have the work that is being done by civil society to establish a defense for the rights of migrant populations and refugees throughout all of Latin America, where the right to education is being worked on so that it be included in social protection, and the right to education is part of what is going to be talked about in this national plan for migrant workers for the Venezuela situation. Some of us are taking care of this in a comprehensive manner, not only in the formal system, but also on the side of the informal system, because there is high informality, but we have many children who say 30–40% of migrant children with the Venezuela situation that have not yet have had access to the educational system. They haven't even been identified with their names. Of course, there is a multiplicity of complexities here. It's not even worth delving into that, but we are speaking of economic possibilities, access to housing, food, etc. A series of elements that the lack of access generates. Xenophobia and social cultural integration are also something that works against us. So if we talk about xenophobia, it's also migrants. So Save the Children, UNESCO, World Plan, World Vision, all the organizations that form part of the regional program work on those processes. As I said, with FOPREL in Central America, and what we're doing in different spaces like the International Commission for Human Rights to include the voice of youth in these processes and to make these educational processes part of this consultation in these participative processes. It needs to be substantive because intersectoriality is based on the fact that children, boys, girls, adolescents are comprehensive human beings, and that is what our mission is based on. We address this in a comprehensive manner, not only as an intersectorial thing, but also as part of their life cycle. And it's very important part of the Sustainable Development Agenda. It is a substantive and core aspect of SDG 4 of the 2030 Agenda. And we've been working on generating tools to strengthen the educational sector, to offer training to faculty, and offer direct support to boys and girls who do not have any access. For example, with socio-emotional tools that we believe is of the utmost importance. We need to add socio-emotional knowledge and tools to this educational offer. It's important to understand the right to education also within the framework of education by competencies, not only based on the curriculum, because there's boys and girls that are not in the educational system yet, and it's very difficult to include them, especially if they are in transit. So we work within a certain context. That's another thing that we do in the national and local systems. As an international NGO, we help strengthen grassroots organizations and local NGOs with our know-how and background.
Gracias, querida. Lo último me entrega el pie para las preguntas que
Thank you. Well, there's a couple of questions from the audience. I will begin from the more recent ones and backward. And first of all, I'd like to invite Yayoi and Manos to turn their cameras on because there may be questions for you. We will not leave you out of this part of the session. Matthew, Susana, here's a question. We've talked a lot about inclusive interventions with the gender focus, with the cultural diversity, but there's a question made, of course, by teachers because they've been asked to come today. How can we take into account the voices of boys, girls, and youth in a way that doesn't only allow us to hear them, but also to adapt to what they say? Are there any examples, specific examples? I know that the question was very specific and I want to honor that. But perhaps an example where you've had to make modifications based on this idea of participation and collaborative work with boys, girls, and adolescents. Thank you, Susana. Well, in fact, we can also talk about this at two levels. At a regional level, throughout the pandemic, for example, we have been promoting spaces not only with UNESCO, but well, through the series of webinars, Not Leaving Anyone Behind, but also we've also opened a series of spaces with the International Commission for Human Rights offering a voice in these sessions to them with declarations and open communications so that governments will form part of these voices and will hear them at a national level. So at a national level, we have a very good example with Colombia. Maria Cristina has been witness to what I'm going to say. But with all our work in Arauca, for example, at the border, the tools have been built not only based on program knowledge, but also with the participation of ministries of education and their accountability, but also with spaces that we have opened for consultation with boys and girls, asking them what their concerns are. And these have been included in the guidelines for education that we have distributed throughout the pandemic. We have worked on their interests. And another example for inclusion within the framework of the pandemic with boys and girls has been to generate radio programs or podcasts that are downloadable and also transmitted by or broadcast by local radio stations based on our trajectory and on the questions asked on elements and things that they find interesting. So the important thing here is to generate spaces to hear them, take notes, and apart from taking note of all that they say and using it as a tool for integration, here I think we're still lacking. We need to continue working on what we return. So if we generate the space for the children to say what they need, we give them a voice, we integrate them into the tool. But when do we say, oh, this that you mentioned is here? So that is what we're missing. I think it's a recommendation that we need to take into consideration what we are returning. So part of this has to do with what is administrative and co-responsibility in the comprehensive care system. People find it complex to open spaces for participation, but it can very well be done with focus groups, webinars. There's many tools at a community level that we can use to open spaces for boys and girls, especially to break this adult-centered paradigm where they have nothing to say and we have the answers to everything. It's the contrary, because they know very well what they need, and when they're a little older, how it can be done. So I leave that with you, some food for thought, and I'd like to offer the floor to Matthew. Perhaps he has several relevant things to supplement this with.
Yes, thank you very much, especially to you, Susanna, for that very enlightening response. What I would add is that for our program, the Equal Place program, we started from a place of using the feedback of the population of concern to build the program. So, you know, the priorities that were identified by our focus group discussions and our many other different ways of gaining feedback were used as the foundation for building the program. And those were the elements that we pursued in the program were in line with the priorities that were identified. Similarly, when we were selecting the different platforms to be used, a number of different platforms were presented to persons from the population of concern. We got feedback from them, and we chose the platforms which the students in particular bought into the most. I think for us, it's really important, I think, to systematize participation. I think it all too often happens that participation, you know, gaining feedback from the population of concern is at many times like a token activity. And I think it's really important to not just to get initial feedback, but to also continuously get feedback and to be able to then incorporate this feedback in a practical way into what you're doing requires a systematization. So in our case, we build one session per week for students to just give feedback to their teachers, and then we have mechanisms by which the teachers will report this feedback to us. We supplement those by having regular focus group discussions. So actually later on today, I'll be having some focus group discussions with some older students who are thinking of leaving the program, for example. And I mean, we want to know why. We want to know if there's anything that we can do to perhaps convince them to stay, or if they don't want to stay, what are some of the services that we can offer them in place of an academic education, for example. So I think that's it for me, but yeah, thanks for the question.
Muchísimas gracias, Matthew. Ahora voy a pasar a una pregunta para Fabiola y María Cristina.
Thank you, Matthew. I have a question for Fabiola y María Cristina. I would like to thank you. Now, the question refers to more detailed information from the ministries, is what the ministries are doing. So this is a question that has been received via Zoom. It's a question related to the following. We've talked a great deal about accessing and guaranteeing the right to education to boys and girls, but it would seem as though this is still something quite pending. That is, adult education is more pending. And so how can we ensure that students have continuity in their educational experience from primary, secondary to tertiary, whether it's technical or professional? So what are the ministries of education doing? Are there any specific initiatives in this realm? Or is this still something that you're just scratching the surface on? Maybe Fabiola, you could start. Fabiola. Sure. As far as we are concerned, to a great extent, my first remarks were related to regular education initiatives through the secondary cycle. Do we have any pending tasks? Well, yes, transition to higher education. Obviously, that's even more complex. It has to do with the background information, trajectory, many other aspects. Let me refer to two specific situations, I think, that have also created a situation in which we are dealing with different time frames in terms of what we're doing at the ministry. Last year, for example, you know that we created and set up the Undersecretariat of Higher Education in our country, and this Undersecretariat seeks specifically to use various tools to address gaps in terms of accreditation. And by law, we have this issue, under law, we have this issue of a free education. So there are a series of situations that have resulted in the establishment of 3 units. We have early childhood education, regular education, and higher education departments. As far as the administrative work and institutional arrangements are concerned, we want to set these up so they will be beneficiary in the long term. But obviously, there's this transitional stage that we're working on. We also have another pending area that we're working on. Let me address 2 aspects. One is transitioning at the end of secondary school into the university entrance exam. There's still some gaps there to address with regard to what the students, their documentation. For example, they have to have a passport or some sort of identification to be able to sign up and take the exam. That's an issue. And then, and here, let me double click on this other group. There's a significant population of students who are in transit. I think we still need to make progress with regard to information that underrepresents their experience, their trajectory. We know that there are some students who have come directly from their country of origin to Chile, but there are other students who've gone through other countries in the region before they reach Chile. So from the moment they leave their country of origin, maybe the Venezuelans, I'm referring to them, may actually take 3 years to get to Chile. as their destination, final destination. And what happens over that 3-year period? As Maria Cristina mentioned and others, we know that they have a variety of different experiences and educational experiences in those transit countries throughout the region. Now, as far as information is concerned, I think it's challenging, and I'm referring to the administrative challenges. We do not have advanced system that allows us to capture these temporary progress that these students make in the transit countries. This is a challenge across the board. For example, and I don't want to take away from the Andres Bello agreement, which is trying to make progress in terms of recognizing the technical professional experiences, but we see that we need to recognize and validate students' past educational experiences in other countries, transit countries. We don't have that tool. We cannot do that yet. And that creates an issue for many of our students, particularly those who are transitioning. They, as a result of that, see that those experiences in the transit countries are not recognized. So they're left, they have gaps. And I think that warrants a whole new discussion, just a can of worms. So this is urgent though for them. And I think all of us working in education are trying to buoy up support for this and mobilize our efforts behind this. It's necessary to make progress here. It's urgent. We know that. It's part of our whole motto of leave no one behind. And it's an increasingly complex issue for them. We need to improve the traceability of information from other countries in the region, make progress with regard to recognizing technical professional studies. And of course, we want everyone to open their doors to foreign students, specifically those in a pending migratory status, so that they can move forward with higher education, because in the end, this is all related to inclusion. We know that we want everyone to be socially included, if you will. Thank you, Fabiola, for such a detailed answer. It's interesting to see that there are very processes underway, and many of them depend on the information available, the population's needs, the demographic changes that we witness as we all evolve. Maria Cristina, your turn. Could you talk about adult education, educational continuity, anything of interest for the audience? Thank you. Of course, I have something interesting to say. This is very much along the lines of what Fabiola said. I think we have a great deal of common ground with Chile. We have been working closely with access, and we are also taking significant steps forward in terms of permanence, but there are still challenges there. And I'm not just referring to boys, girls, and adolescents, but also adults who are migrating and immigrating. As I mentioned earlier, obviously, we see individuals who are in transit or who are willing to stay in the country. So we need to provide access to them, equal opportunity in the education system, regardless of their status. And it's important to have strategies that allow children to stay in school and to interact. There are equality issues as well, but we also must bear in mind the family situation. There are internal factors that come into play here. So this is all important to take into consideration when we address the complete educational trajectory. Now, within the Ministry of Education in Colombia, we have worked significantly on documentation, and that's why we have also tried to standardize or regulate migration so that we can come up with pedagogical processes that are more flexible to meet the needs of the migrant population. There's an example, for example, of something that we want to scale up to the national level. We've had a good experience with the Norwegian Council for Refugees, and we conducted an exercise during the COVID emergency, and we worked in those areas with a significant high percentage of Venezuelan migrants. We worked on border areas as well, Arauca, La Guajira, Santander. These are some of the departments with a high percentage of this population, and we've conducted some interesting exercises actively seeking out those individuals and also trying to ensure that their needs, boys and girls' needs, are met with regard to their learning process. And we wanted to connect a survey, figure out what stage they're in, and come up with prevention strategies to keep them from repeating years. We have also reached a peace agreement that was signed on the 16th. There are certain bodies that are part of this armed conflict that we have been dealing with for so many years, and we need to ensure how the education sector will be able to contribute to ensuring that the students stay in school. And we have preventive actions trying to prevent these students from being recruited for these armed conflicts. And as I mentioned, we're trying to come up with comprehensive, integral responses from the state for the families, so that and children, so they can stay in school and so that they can have this comprehensive family unit. So we continue to do this. We have strategies, but obviously this is still challenging, and public policies continually face this challenge. As far as integral development and complete educational experiences, we have bet on those as our way forward from within the sector. We work closely with local actors. The Ministry of Education has, as a public policy body, we have a program called Together We Can Do This. This is framed within the pandemic, and we have worked closely with local organizations to prevent school dropouts and students from repeating, and we're working closely with the displaced population as a result of the armed conflict, refugees, migrants, people who are more vulnerable and poor. We are ensuring access through this program so they can stay in school. And as far as higher education is concerned, we've also made significant progress in terms of validating previous experience and certifying previous school experiences and education, university experiences, in order to ensure that adults have more opportunities. We have an adult literacy program as well in rural areas, remote areas. We have worked with ethnic groups in those areas, and we have also included the migrant population. Many of these individuals end up recruiting their own children to work in the field. I think it's important to make those visible as well. We work with a diverse group of individuals within this country, a country that's pluri-ethnic, multicultural, 55 native languages, and clearly that's part of our challenge. It's important to recognize government progress as well. I mentioned this under the leadership of the educational sector and the migrant support sector. We have made progress with regard to access to education, but we need to do more. We need to secure permanency and other aspects. So thank you. Thank you very much, Maria Cristina. Now, I have a question for Manos and Yayoi. This is related to an issue that we mentioned early on, but we didn't delve into detail there, and I'm referring to available information. What information is available on historically marginalized group or groups that are at a greater risk of being vulnerable or marginalized? Now, Manos, I would like to refer to the report. Now, what information would you say is still pending and that represents a challenge in this region? And then for Yayoi, what are we doing regionally, and what is the importance of actually ensuring that we have more robust education information systems? Let's start with you, Manos. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Paula. It's true the report addresses the issue of data. and it marks the considerable progress that the region has made over the years to expand the availability of data beyond what governments collect routinely through their administrative systems, to also cover household surveys and also the learning assessments that provides more direct information on the background, individual background of students, and that allows us to understand much better the relative performance of these students and their potential needs. I mean, one of the examples that to some extent is indirectly related to migration, at least the internal migration, is the example of ethnicity and how over time, going back 30 years ago, very few countries in the world were actually, in the region, were actually including questions on ethnicity. These days, this is no longer the case. All, except for one Spanish-speaking country in the region, has a question on ethnicity. And of course, the country that does not is one I mentioned earlier, is finding the challenge of inclusion quite difficult, because every country has challenges when it comes to inclusion. There's no country, even those that do best, really have to struggle with the concept of inclusion and how it applies in their particular context. I could go on and say a few, groups that, because as I mentioned, no individual person has just one identity. They're overlapping identities, and we need to know more than just the one characteristic. Migration, of course, is a complex one, just because of the fluidity and the fact that no education system can adjust, quickly enough to cover that information. Of course, in the case of the Venezuelan crisis, we have the excellent example of how R4V has really adjusted and captured information on a very systematic basis. But when it comes to dealing with individual countries and trying to extract information and link this information to education attendance, we've found it difficult, even talking to governments in some cases. But there are other characteristics that show how progress is being made. Disability is one characteristic that is, of course, associated with extreme vulnerability. And over time, and the report documents that there has been very interesting progress in how countries are adopting the new approach of assessing disability, which is no longer a medical approach, but it is a social approach. Is an approach that requires, that recognizes that people do not have any intrinsic characteristic. It's the environment around them that constrains them from achieving their full potential. So the Washington Group questions, as they're known, recognize that, and they're increasingly being absorbed in national statistical systems. They have been used also in the region. For example, when it comes to example like Costa Rica or Chile or Suriname, they have used these questions, and it would be very interesting to see how also education systems adopt them, because they have been mainly used at the household survey level and not yet within an education system. So there's still a lot of fragmentation, and there are also 9 countries in the region, as the report shows, that do not even at all capture disability in their administrative data. I could go on and mention several examples, but I know it's getting late, so I pass the baton to Yayo if she wants to add any insights from her point of view.
Thank you, Manos. Thank you, Paula. Well, as we know very well, the nature of mobility in the region is very complicated and involves so many countries, at least 17 or even more across the region. So there's even greater, more critical need to have evidence and information now to help decision makers to make informed decisions, and almost for those working at a technical level to be able to monitor and keep track of the effectiveness and also efficiency of the programs being provided to the populations in need. In this case, I think that with a very strong commitment of member states in the region that have been bearing the huge burden, and also with a lot of support from partners, I think this region is making good progress. And just to give an example, during this year's process of Quito conference chaired by Chile, there was a firm commitment on the part of 17 member states to establish the regional monitoring framework that would enable of course, that would, of course, on the basis of solidarity, within the region, that would enable tracking and monitoring, not only access, but also eventually learning to the extent of learning of refugee and migrant learners across the region, hopefully in the near future at all levels. So I think that there is already a very strong commitment and also the readiness to work towards that direction, realizing the need, particularly Fabiola mentioned that about the fact that this refugee learners and migrants, they don't necessarily jump on a plane coming from one place to another. They do pass through different points within countries or even outside their own countries. So we don't, and they end up, by the time they arrive in the country of destination, they may end up losing quite a lot of learning years, and without having the information what actually happened during the trajectory of this movements that learners go through as they move from country to another place to another place within even the same country. I mean, it's very, we might as well have them lose out so much in their learning, and also probability of doing better in life as a result of loss of learning, loss of time necessary for their knowledge, and also the skills needed to cope with the current situations, and also moving beyond. So the fact that the countries have coming together to develop this monitoring framework, and with a lot of support from UNESCO and also regional education group, I think it's a very, very positive step forward. And I believe in the next year or so, this joint initiative will bear fruit, and so that there will be more, not only more data will be available, but also the quality, not only the amount, the quantity of data will be available, but also be able to really understand what goes on in the lives and or learning experiences of refugee and migrant learners in the region. Back to you, Paula.
Muchísimas gracias, Yayoi. Estoy enfrentándome a la misión extremadamente compleja.
Thank you, Yayoi. I have the extremely difficult message of offering some key messages in a session that has been very diverse and with many relevant topics. I'd like to share a few core comments. Of course, access has been important. The region has considerably increased in guaranteeing access with its initiatives. It seems that the challenges are more oriented to guaranteeing the right to education in all its dimensions. In the second place, I would like to stress the comments on sectorial work, not only thinking of different levels of education, but also thinking about it together with national migratory policies, protecting childhood at all levels and all its dimensions, with policies that will supplement the educational service, considering food services, transport, food supplies, uniforms in some cases, and other important elements. And I would like to also especially mention something that is in the GEM report, which is rethinking education, not only for migrant educations, refugees or displaced, but also for students in the host communities, because many who are in the field have seen how the community transforms with students from other nationalities that come and need new educational opportunities with different experiences, and this is very important with a broader vision of inclusion. Another point that is a little more personal, I'd like to insist on it. We live in a region where the multiple dimensions are not only migration, sometimes migration and natural disasters, situations in borders, gender violence, and other dimensions that strongly affect girls and women. And it is increasingly relevant to see how these overlapping dimensions express themselves in the educational world. That is the message left by the GEM report. Before concluding, I would like to thank our colleagues. You have seen me throughout the session, but there's many colleagues who have tirelessly worked to carry out this session. I'd like to especially mention Jimena Arroyo, Zafirio, Luis Pino, and many other colleagues who have working several days to make this possible and successful. So, as you all know, all the materials will be uploaded to the website that we will publish soon. My colleagues have been sharing information, the GEM report and other important material throughout the session. So we are at your disposal for any questions or requirements that you may have based on today's session. And that is all for now. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you have an excellent evening, wonderful holidays, and I hope you have some days off. Thank you very much.
Paula. Un abrazo para todos.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you to all. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Paula, once again to the UNESCO team. Thank you.